Have you ever found yourself trapped in the loop of making familiar choices yet expecting different outcomes? You're not alone. Most of us rely on conventional wisdom, industry best practices, and untested assumptions, only to find ourselves spinning our wheels, caught in the cycle of incremental improvements and predictable results. But what if you could escape this loop by mastering a strategic approach proven by the world's most innovative thinkers? In First Principles, the radical path to strategic thinking, you'll unlock the power of first principles reasoning, the exact methodology leveraged by trailblazers like Elon Musk and Sarah Blakely to redefine industries, shatter assumptions, and achieve breakthroughs once thought impossible. Instead of offering more of the same tactical tips, this book presents a rigorous, systematic way to dissect complexity, challenge hidden beliefs, and rebuild your strategies on undeniable truths. You'll learn how to convert constraints into opportunities, turn assumptions into actionable insights, and systematically engineer strategic calm amid uncertainty. As you dive into the book, you'll explore practical methods for breaking down complex problems to uncover opportunities you might have overlooked. You'll also gain techniques for identifying those hidden assumptions that silently undermine your best efforts, and learn how to test them rigorously. Additionally, you'll discover frameworks that turn limitations and constraints into powerful sources of creativity and innovation. Ultimately, First Principles will equip you with the clarity and confidence to tackle any strategic challenge, even when overwhelmed by complexity, allowing you to stop reacting and start strategically creating your future. If you're ready to elevate your thinking and radically transform your results, the journey begins here. Chapter 1. Start at zero. The rocket exploded, again. SpaceX's third Falcon 1 test flight had just turned into a $20 million fireball, and Elon Musk stood watching his dreams literally go up in smoke. Most entrepreneurs would have started tweaking the design, hiring more engineers, or raising more capital. Musk did something different. He went back to physics. Instead of accepting the aerospace industry's cost assumptions, that rockets must cost $100 million because they always have, he stripped the problem to its atomic level. What does it actually cost to buy the raw materials for a rocket? Aluminum, carbon fiber, fuel. The answer shocked him, less than 2% of the typical rocket's price tag. Everything else was legacy thinking, bureaucratic bloat, and unquestioned assumptions masquerading as engineering truth. This is first principles thinking in action, and it's about to become your secret weapon. The noise machine is winning. Your business is drowning in best practices that aren't best for you. Teams copy what worked for companies 10 times their size in different markets with different constraints. Tools multiply like weeds. Metrics pile up until nobody remembers what they're measuring or why. Every framework promises to be the answer, but the noise just gets louder. The symptoms are everywhere. Meetings turn into opinion wars because nobody can distinguish between facts and beliefs. Projects drag on for months while teams debate which proven approach to copy. Decision paralysis sets in because everything feels equally urgent, equally important, equally backed by some guru's success story. Meanwhile, your assumptions compound like interest, but in reverse. That belief about what customers will pay, it's been untested for 2 years. The constraint that forces you to use that expensive vendor, nobody remembers why it exists. The sacred cow process that ensures quality, it's actually creating the delays everyone complains about. This isn't just inefficiency, it's a trap that gets tighter every quarter. Local optimizations pile up while the core model stays broken. Headcount grows to compensate for process failures. Burnout spreads as effort increases, but results plateau. You're working harder to run in place. The compound clarity alternative. But there's another path. When you strip problems to their irreducible truths and rebuild from evidence, something magical happens. Fewer assumptions mean faster decision cycles. Each test upgrades your next choice. Knowledge compounds instead of cluttering. Sarah Blakely discovered this when she couldn't find pantyhose that didn't have feet. Instead of accepting the industry's design assumptions, she went back to the fundamental job. Smooth silhouette, comfort, invisibility. She cut the feet off her own pantyhose, tested with real women, and built Spanx into a billion-dollar category with $5,000 in savings. Constraint-driven design, relentless assumption testing, and clear invariance, comfort, simplicity, discretion, created a moat competitors still can't cross. Jeff Bezos built Amazon on a similar foundation. His reversible versus irreversible decision framework cut months off product launches. Customer obsession became an invariant that aligned every choice. Long-term thinking about second-order effects, Prime, logistics, AWS, created flywheels that compound advantage every quarter. Reed Hastings saw the streaming shift coming because he thought in systems, not just products. While Blockbuster optimized store locations, Netflix was designing the infrastructure for a world without stores. The bet structure aligned incentives across content, data, and distribution. Principal stacking across every function created a machine that learns and adapts faster than rivals can copy. The firefighting trap. Without this foundation, you're headed for permanent firefighting mode. Urgent will crowd out important forever. You'll become an operator in your own business instead of its architect. Vacations will create chaos because nothing runs without your constant intervention. Sharper competitors will outmaneuver you with less effort. They'll win on positioning while you compete on price. Your best talent will leave for companies with clearer direction and calmer cultures. Projects will drag on with sunk cost bias driving decisions. Customer acquisition costs will climb while lifetime value stagnates. Your runway will shorten as stress spikes. The math is brutal but simple. Without strategic clarity, every dollar an hour gets less effective over time. Complexity compounds, waste accelerates. The business owns you instead of serving you. Your First Principles Toolkit. This chapter gives you 3 tools that stack together into a thinking operating system. First Principles Decomposition breaks any problem into facts, constraints, and resources, the irreducible realities you can actually work with. Assumption auditing exposes the hidden beliefs driving your choices and converts them into testable claims. Abstraction laddering lets you move up to essence and down to execution without losing the thread. Together, they form a bias-proof lens for strategy. You'll define objectives in one precise sentence. List your non-negotiable invariants. Specify what's inside versus outside your control. Create an assumption ledger ranked by risk and uncertainty. Convert your riskiest beliefs into minimum viable hypotheses with clear kill criteria. The process is simple, but not easy. Start by clarifying your aim and invariance. What must remain true no matter what changes? Lock the language. Remove ambiguity. Share publicly to align your team. Next, decompose the problem to its primitives. Separate evidence from story. Map cause and effect at a high level. Then audit your assumptions ruthlessly. Expose sacred cows. Label each belief as belief, not fact. Prioritize by impact times uncertainty. Reword as testable claims. Design minimum viable hypotheses, the smallest test that can change your mind. Define falsification thresholds before testing. Timebox everything. Keep tests cheap and reversible. Finally, update and stack. Apply Bayesian thinking in plain English. Start with a prior belief. Gather evidence. Update to a posterior belief. Codify what works into simple principles. Rinse and repeat weekly. Why this order matters. Direction must precede motion. Getting the aim right saves months of execution in the wrong direction. Testing before scaling protects capital and credibility. Updating prevents ego traps that keep bad ideas alive too long. Clear invariants align decisions across the team. Common maps beat personal opinions every time. Principles outlive people and create institutional memory that compounds. Each loop improves the next loop. Less rework, more reuse. Momentum replaces friction. Winners think different. Winners seek disproof. Losers seek comfort. They ask, prove me wrong, instead of prove me right. Evidence trumps ego. They change fast and proudly when data demands it. Winners love constraints. Losers resist them. Constraints focus creativity into productive channels. Rules prevent thrash. Scarcity breeds invention. Winners think in systems. Losers chase hacks. They build flywheels, not one-offs. They hunt for cause, not correlation. The mindset shift is everything. Stop asking what worked for them. Start asking what must be true for us. Stop copying best practices. Start building your own principles from evidence. Stop optimizing parts. Start designing systems. The path forward. Your journey through strategic thinking starts here, at zero. Strip away the noise, question the assumptions, test the beliefs, build from truth, not tradition. The next chapter, Decompose Reality, will show you exactly how to break complex problems into their component parts and rebuild them stronger. But that's just the beginning. What you'll discover about the hidden structure of your business and the leverage points that can transform it with minimal effort might surprise you. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Grow to the Top and activate notifications to receive more self-improvement tips that will supercharge your growth. And make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you for your support. Chapter 2, Decompose Reality. Richard Feynman was stumped. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist sat in his Caltech office, staring at a problem that had defeated some of the brightest minds in quantum mechanics. Instead of diving into the existing literature or consulting with colleagues, he did something that seemed almost naive. He closed all the textbooks, ignored the established theories, and started from scratch. "I'm going to rederive everything from first principles," he told his graduate students. "If I can't rebuild it from the ground up, I don't really understand it." What happened next changed physics forever. By stripping away decades of accumulated assumptions and rebuilding from basic observations, Feynman discovered new pathways through quantum field theory that had been invisible to experts who were too close to the existing frameworks. His approach didn't just solve the problem, it revealed why the problem had seemed unsolvable in the first place. This is the power of decomposition, and it's about to transform how you see your business. The premise trap. Most strategic failures don't happen during execution. They happen before the first meeting, before the first hire, before the first dollar is spent. They happen when you build on the wrong premise. Perfect execution on a flawed foundation is worse than no execution at all. It burns resources, builds false confidence, and creates sunk costs that make course correction nearly impossible. You can optimize every metric, hit every deadline, and still end up in the wrong place because you never questioned what you were optimizing toward. The symptoms are everywhere, but they're often disguised as progress. Teams celebrate hitting targets that don't matter. Processes get refined to solve problems that shouldn't exist. Metrics multiply because nobody can agree on what success actually looks like. Everyone's busy, but nobody can explain why the business isn't growing faster. This happens because most businesses operate on inherited assumptions rather than verified truths. Our customers want the cheapest option. Quality takes time. We need more features to compete. These beliefs get passed down like folklore, unquestioned and untested, until they become the invisible constraints that limit every decision. But here's what most leaders miss. The biggest leverage often comes from questioning the premise, not improving the execution. When you decompose a problem to its atomic level, you often discover that the real problem is different from what everyone assumed. Sometimes it's simpler. Sometimes it's in a completely different domain. Sometimes it doesn't exist at all. The atomic method. Decomposition isn't about breaking things into smaller pieces. It's about finding the irreducible elements that actually matter. Think of it like chemistry. You can break water into hydrogen and oxygen, but you can't break hydrogen into anything simpler without changing its fundamental nature. In business, these atomic elements fall into three categories: facts, constraints, and resources. Facts are things you can measure or observe without interpretation. Constraints are limits that genuinely can't be changed. Resources are assets you can deploy or combine. Everything else is story, assumption, or inherited wisdom that may or may not be true. The magic happens when you separate these cleanly. Most strategic confusion comes from mixing facts with beliefs or treating preferences as constraints. When you strip a problem down to its atoms and rebuild from there, You often discover that what seemed complex was actually simple, or that what seemed simple was hiding real complexity in the wrong places. Take Sarah Blakely's approach to creating Spanx. The fashion industry had decades of accumulated wisdom about hosiery design, manufacturing requirements, and retail distribution. Instead of accepting these premises, she decomposed the problem to its essence. Women wanted smooth silhouettes under white pants without visible panty lines or uncomfortable seams. Everything else was negotiable. By rebuilding from this atomic truth, she discovered that most industry requirements were actually preferences that had calcified into rules. The result wasn't just a successful product, it was an entirely new category that competitors still struggle to understand. The assumption audit. Hidden beliefs are strategy killers. They lurk in every plan, every process, every decision framework. They masquerade as facts because they've gone unchallenged for so long. They create blind spots that persist until someone finally asks the dangerous question, what if that's not true? The assumption audit makes these invisible beliefs visible. It forces you to distinguish between what you know and what you think you know. It ranks beliefs by their impact and uncertainty, then converts the riskiest ones into testable claims. This isn't academic exercise, it's survival skill. Markets change faster than assumptions update. Customer preferences shift while business models stay static. Competitive advantages erode while teams optimize for yesterday's game. The companies that thrive are the ones that update their beliefs as fast as reality changes. Jeff Bezos built Amazon on this principle. His famous reversible versus irreversible decision framework came from decomposing the nature of business choices themselves. Most decisions, he realized, are reversible. You can change course if you're wrong. But teams treat them like irreversible decisions, adding layers of analysis and approval that slow everything down. By separating reversible from irreversible decisions at the atomic level, Amazon could move faster on the majority of choices while applying appropriate rigor to the few that truly mattered. This wasn't just operational efficiency, it was strategic advantage through better decision architecture. The ladder of truth. Abstraction laddering is your navigation system between the concrete and the conceptual. It lets you zoom out to see the bigger picture, then zoom back in to specific actions without losing the thread that connects them. Moving up the ladder means asking, why does this matter, until you reach the essential purpose. Moving down means asking, how will we actually do this, until you reach specific, measurable actions. The key is keeping both levels connected. Strategy that can't be executed is fantasy, and tactics that don't serve strategy are waste. Most strategic failures happen when these levels disconnect. Teams get lost in high-level vision without concrete next steps, or they get buried in tactical execution without understanding the larger purpose. The latter keeps you grounded in reality while reaching for meaningful outcomes. Richard Feynman mastered this technique in physics, but it applies to any complex domain. When he couldn't understand quantum electrodynamics through existing theories, he climbed down to the most basic observations about how particles behave, then climbed back up to build new mathematical frameworks. The result was a simpler, more powerful way to understand reality. The dangerous myths. 3 myths kill decomposition before it starts. The first is, we'll break it down later. Later never comes. Once you're deep in execution, sunk costs and political momentum make premise changes nearly impossible. The time to decompose is before you commit resources, not after you've spent them. The second myth is experts already know. Experts carry valuable knowledge, but they also carry bias. They're invested in existing frameworks and may miss opportunities that require thinking outside established categories. Markets change faster than expertise updates. Verify, then trust. The third myth is details don't matter. Details are often where the real leverage hides. The difference between success and failure frequently comes down to seemingly minor implementation choices that compound over time. Edge cases become main cases at scale. Fit and finish drive adoption more than features. The decomposition toolkit. The atomic breakdown exercise starts with writing your goal in one precise sentence. Then ask, what must be true for this to work? 5 times, going deeper each time. Sort the answers into facts, constraints, and resources. Label everything as either evidence or belief. The assumption ledger captures 10 beliefs that underlie your strategy. Score each by impact times uncertainty. Convert the top 3 into falsifiable statements, claims that could be proven wrong with specific evidence. Assign a quick evidence source to each. The laddering drill takes one primitive element and moves up 3 levels, asking why does this matter? Then down 3 levels, asking how will we implement? The goal is ensuring your highest purpose connects to your most concrete actions. Time box the entire process to 90 minutes. Enough time to get clarity, not enough to get lost in analysis. Share a draft and iterate later. Speak in verbs, must, will, cannot, to force commitment. Read everything aloud to catch fluff and ensure shared understanding. The compound effect. When decomposition works, the results compound quickly. One bad assumption killed early can save months of misdirected effort. Decision latency drops because the team shares a common map. Scope gets clearer because you know what actually matters. At the excellent level, you discover simpler models that produce equal or better outcomes. New opportunities become visible that were hidden by old assumptions. At the best level, you rewrite entire quarterly plans on stronger premises, creating competitive advantages that competitors can't see, let alone copy. But beware the failure modes. Analysis paralysis kills momentum. Set hard stops and ship version 1. Overgeneralizing loses the connection to reality. Pair every abstraction with concrete examples. Ego protection prevents truth-seeking. Invite red team feedback and reward disproof publicly. The reality check. Decomposition isn't just about understanding your business better. It's about building a shared language that reduces politics and aligns action. When everyone operates from the same map of reality, handoffs tighten, rework falls, and momentum builds. The companies that master this skill don't just execute better, they see opportunities others miss. They adapt faster because their beliefs update with evidence. They waste less because their premises are sound. They scale more predictably because their foundations are solid. But decomposition is just the beginning. Once you've stripped your strategy down to its atomic elements, you need to know which constraints to embrace and which to transcend. The next chapter reveals how the smartest leaders turn limitations into leverage and why the tightest constraints often produce the most elegant solutions. Chapter 3, Constraint Design. Sarah Blakely had $5,000 and a problem nobody else seemed to notice. Standing in her Atlanta apartment, she held up a pair of white pants and a pair of pantyhose. The combination looked terrible. Visible panty lines, uncomfortable seams, and those ridiculous feet that showed through open-toed shoes. The hosiery industry had been solving this problem for decades, with more features, more options, more complexity. Blakely saw it differently. What if the solution wasn't addition, but subtraction? She took scissors to her pantyhose and cut off the feet. The result was revolutionary in its simplicity. But here's what most people miss about the Spanx story. The real innovation wasn't the product modification. It was how Blakely turned her limitations into design principles that created an entirely new category. No fashion industry connections, designed for real women, not industry insiders. No manufacturing experience, partner with existing facilities and focus on the customer experience. Minimal capital, create one perfect product instead of a full line. Every constraint became a creative catalyst. This is constraint design in action, and it's about to become your secret weapon for turning limitations into leverage. The paradox of infinite options. Most entrepreneurs think freedom comes from having unlimited choices. More budget, more time, more resources, more possibilities. But infinite options create infinite paralysis. When everything is possible, nothing gets prioritized. Teams spin their wheels debating alternatives instead of executing decisions. The counterintuitive truth is that constraints create freedom. Not the freedom to do everything, but the freedom to do the right things exceptionally well. Constraints force focus. They eliminate waste. They channel creativity into productive directions instead of letting it scatter across endless possibilities. Think about the most innovative companies you know. Apple's obsession with simplicity constrains every design decision. Amazon's customer obsession filters every strategic choice. Netflix's data-driven culture limits what gets greenlit. These aren't limitations. They're competitive advantages disguised as rules. But most leaders resist constraints because they confuse them with limitations. A limitation is something imposed from outside that restricts your options. A constraint is something you choose that focuses your energy. Limitations weaken you. Constraints strengthen you by concentrating force where it matters most. The difference is intentionality. When you design your constraints deliberately, they become the architecture of excellence. When constraints are imposed randomly or inherited unconsciously, they become the source of frustration and inefficiency. The architecture of excellence. Constraint design starts with identifying your invariants, the non-negotiable truths that must remain constant no matter what else changes. These aren't aspirational values or marketing slogans. They're operational principles that you're willing to sacrifice short-term gains to protect. Sarah Blakely's invariants were crystal clear: comfort, simplicity, and discretion. Every product decision, every marketing choice, every partnership opportunity got filtered through these three principles. When retailers suggested adding more SKUs, she said no. When manufacturers proposed cost-cutting changes that affected comfort, she refused. When competitors launched flashier campaigns, she stayed focused on authentic testimonials from real women. These invariants weren't restrictions. They were the foundation of a billion-dollar moat. Competitors could copy the product, but they couldn't copy the constraint-driven culture that created it. The rules themselves became the competitive advantage. Jeff Bezos understood this principle when he established Amazon's leadership principles. Customer obsession wasn't just a nice phrase, it was an operational constraint that shaped every decision. When faced with trade-offs between short-term profits and long-term customer value, the constraint provided the answer. No debate necessary, no committee required. The rule decided. This is how constraints create speed, not slowness. When your principles are clear, decisions become automatic. Energy that would otherwise be spent on endless deliberation gets redirected toward execution. Teams move faster because they know which direction to move. The creative catalyst effect. The myth that constraints kill creativity is backwards. Blank canvases freeze teams. Unlimited budgets create waste. Open-ended briefs generate mediocre work. The most innovative solutions emerge from the tightest constraints because limitations force you to find elegant workarounds. Consider how Twitter's 140-character limit spawned an entirely new form of communication. The constraint wasn't a bug, it was the feature. It forced users to distill thoughts to their essence. It created a unique rhythm and style that couldn't be replicated on platforms without similar limits. When Twitter expanded to 280 characters, much of the creative tension disappeared. Or look at how Southwest Airlines turned operational constraints into strategic advantages. By flying only Boeing 737s, they simplified maintenance, training, and scheduling. By focusing on point-to-point routes instead of hub-and-spoke networks, they reduced complexity and increased efficiency. By eliminating assigned seating and meal service, they accelerated turnaround times. Each constraint eliminated options, but amplified performance. The key insight is that constraints don't limit creativity, they redirect it. Instead of exploring infinite possibilities, creative energy gets focused on finding the best solution within defined boundaries. This produces breakthrough innovations that wouldn't emerge in unconstrained environments. When you're designing constraints for your business, think about them as creative catalysts rather than creative killers. What limitations could force your team to find more elegant solutions? What boundaries could channel innovation toward your most important challenges? What rules could eliminate low-value options and amplify high-value opportunities? The resource multiplication effect. The most dangerous myth in business is we need more resources first. More budget without clear constraints creates more waste. More time without deadlines creates more delay. More people without defined roles creates more confusion. Resources without rules multiply chaos, not results. Smart leaders flip this equation. They start with constraints that define how resources will be used, then acquire only the resources needed to execute within those boundaries. This approach multiplies the effective value of every dollar, hour, and person. Sarah Blakely's $5,000 budget forced creative solutions that venture-backed competitors couldn't match. She couldn't afford traditional advertising, so she built word of mouth through authentic customer experiences. She couldn't hire a large team, so she focused on one product done exceptionally well. She couldn't compete on features, so she competed on the emotional connection with her core customer. These weren't compromises, they were advantages. The constraints forced her to build a more sustainable, more defensible business model than competitors with unlimited resources. When you have to be creative with limited resources, you often discover more efficient ways to achieve your goals. The constraint canvas exercise helps you identify these resource multiplication opportunities. Map your current limitations, budget, capacity, compliance requirements, time windows. Then reframe each limitation as a design principle. Instead of, we only have X budget, think we design for maximum impact with X budget. Instead of, we only have Y capacity, think we design for efficiency within Y capacity. This mental shift transforms constraints from obstacles into opportunities. You start looking for ways to work with your limitations rather than against them. You discover leverage points that wouldn't be visible if resources were unlimited. The scaling paradox. Most businesses break when they scale because they confuse growth with addition. They add more products, more features, more processes, more people. But addition without constraint creates complexity that eventually collapses under its own weight. The businesses that scale successfully do so by multiplication, not addition. Multiplication happens when you identify the core elements that create value, then find ways to amplify them without adding complexity. This requires clear constraints that define what you will and won't do as you grow. Without these guardrails, growth becomes a cancer that consumes the very advantages that made growth possible. Amazon's constraint-driven approach to scaling illustrates this principle. Instead of adding complexity as they grew, they simplified operations through automation and standardization. Instead of expanding into random markets, they followed clear principles about customer value and operational leverage. Instead of building everything from scratch, they created platforms that others could build on. Each constraint acted as a filter that prevented complexity creep. New opportunities got evaluated against existing principles. Projects that didn't align with core constraints got eliminated before they could drain resources. The result was growth that strengthened the business rather than weakening it. The implementation framework. Building effective constraints requires a systematic approach. Start with your invariant list, 5 rules that must remain true regardless of external pressure. These should be specific enough to guide decisions, but flexible enough to allow innovation within boundaries. Stress test each invariant by imagining scenarios where violating it would be tempting. If breaking the rule wouldn't cause real damage to your business model or brand promise, it's not a true invariant. Keep only the constraints that matter when broken. Next, create your constraint canvas by mapping real limitations: budget, capacity, compliance, time windows. For each limitation, design a positive rule that turns the constraint into a creative catalyst. We design for customers who value X over Y. We build solutions that work within Z timeframe. We create experiences that require no more than W resources. Test each constraint by piloting it on a small scope. Observe how it changes behavior and decision-making. Promote the rules that create positive outcomes. Retire the ones that create unnecessary friction without adding value. Name your constraints with memorable labels that stick in team conversations: the comfort rule, the 2-week test, the single-screen standard. Put these labels where work happens, in planning documents, on meeting room walls, in project templates. Keep a wildcard lane for ideas that don't fit current constraints. Reserve one slot per cycle for non-conforming experiments. This prevents overconstraint while maintaining focus on your core principles. The compound advantage. When constraint design works, the benefits compound quickly. Decision speed increases because the rules provide clear guidance. Project scope shrinks because non-essential features get filtered out automatically. Team alignment improves because everyone operates from the same principles. At the excellent level, you'll see cycle time reductions of 20% or more as rule-based flow eliminates unnecessary deliberation. Offer redesigns driven by constraint thinking can lift gross margins by 5 to 10 percentage points. Teams report lower thrash and higher satisfaction because they're working within clear boundaries. At the best level, constraints become the source of unique, defensible market positions. You create moats through promises you can always keep because your constraints ensure consistent delivery. Culture begins to self-police quality because the rules become internalized habits rather than external impositions. But beware the failure modes. Fake invariants that don't actually constrain behavior create cynicism and confusion. Overconstraint can stifle necessary innovation and adaptation. Team resistance emerges when constraints feel imposed rather than co-created. The solution is to involve your team in constraint design. Explain the strategic reasoning behind each rule, and demonstrate the positive outcomes that result from working within boundaries. Start with pilot teams to showcase wins before rolling out organization-wide. The hidden structure. Constraint design isn't just about improving efficiency or focus. It's about creating the hidden structure that determines how your business behaves under pressure. When constraints are well designed, they create predictable patterns that stakeholders can rely on. When constraints are poorly designed or absent, chaos emerges whenever stress increases. The most successful leaders understand that constraints aren't limitations to overcome. They're the architecture of sustainable advantage. They create the conditions for excellence to emerge naturally rather than requiring heroic effort to maintain. But constraint design is only the beginning of strategic architecture. Once you've established the boundaries that focus your energy, you need to understand the dynamic forces that operate within those boundaries. The next chapter reveals how to map the invisible systems that actually drive your results, and why the most important levers are often the ones nobody talks about. Chapter 4: Causal Systems. W. Edwards Deming walked into the Ford Motor Company boardroom in 1981 and said something that stunned the executives into silence. Your quality problems aren't caused by lazy workers or defective parts. They're caused by your system. Ford was hemorrhaging market share to Japanese automakers. Defect rates were astronomical. Customer satisfaction was plummeting. The natural response was to blame the people. Fire the bad workers, replace the incompetent managers, motivate everyone to try harder. But Deming saw something different when he looked at Ford's operations. He saw invisible forces. The reward systems that punished workers for slowing down to fix problems. The information flows that hid defects until cars reached customers. The feedback loops that amplified small errors into massive recalls. The delays between cause and effect that made learning nearly impossible. Ford wasn't failing because of bad people. It was failing because of bad structure. What happened next transformed not just Ford, but the entire understanding of how organizations actually work. And it's about to change how you see your business forever. The invisible architecture. Every business runs on two levels. There's the visible level, the org chart, the processes, the metrics everyone tracks. Then there's the invisible level, the causal forces that actually determine what happens. Most leaders spend all their time managing the visible level, while the invisible level drives all their results. This invisible architecture consists of cause and effect relationships, feedback loops, and system boundaries that create the conditions for success or failure. When you can see these forces clearly, you gain the power to reshape them. When you can't see them, you're forever fighting symptoms while the root causes remain untouched. Think about the last time your team struggled with a persistent problem. Maybe it was missed deadlines, quality issues, or customer churn. The visible response was probably to work harder, add more oversight, or implement new procedures. But what if the real problem was structural? What if the system itself was designed to produce the exact outcomes you were trying to prevent? This is the insight that separates strategic thinkers from tactical managers. Strategic thinkers see the system that produces behaviors. Tactical managers see only the behaviors themselves. One group changes structures. The other group changes people. Guess which approach creates lasting transformation? The challenge is that causal systems are invisible by default. You can't see a feedback loop the way you can see a broken machine. You can't touch a system boundary the way you can touch a physical wall. These forces exist in the relationships between things, not in the things themselves. Learning to see them requires a different kind of vision. The map reveals the territory. Causal mapping is your X-ray vision for business systems. It makes the invisible visible by drawing the actual relationships that drive outcomes. But this isn't about creating complex diagrams that look impressive in presentations. It's about building simple, actionable maps that reveal where small changes can create large effects. The basic elements are straightforward. Nodes represent variables, things that can increase or decrease. Arrows represent causal relationships. When one thing changes, it causes another thing to change. Polarity shows direction. Positive arrows mean more of A leads to more of B. Negative arrows mean more of A leads to less of B. But the real power emerges when you start connecting these elements into loops. Reinforcing loops create exponential growth or decline. Success breeds success, failure breeds failure. Balancing loops create stability and resistance to change. They're the immune system that keeps things from spinning out of control. Jeff Bezos understood this when he designed Amazon's flywheel. Customer experience drives traffic. More traffic attracts sellers. More sellers expand selection. Better selection improves customer experience. Lower costs enable lower prices, which improve customer experience even more. Each element reinforces the others, creating compound momentum that competitors struggle to match. The genius wasn't in any single element, it was in how the elements connected. The structure itself became Amazon's competitive advantage because it created self-reinforcing improvement that didn't require constant management intervention. The boundary problem. Most strategic failures happen at the boundaries, the invisible lines that separate what you control from what you don't. When these boundaries are unclear, teams waste energy trying to influence external forces while neglecting internal levers they could actually move. The boundary exercise forces clarity about sphere of influence. Draw a rectangle. Inside the box, list variables you can directly control: hiring decisions, process design, resource allocation, pricing strategies. Outside the box, put external forces: economic conditions, competitor actions, platform algorithm changes, regulatory shifts. This seems simple, but the implications are profound. How much of your strategic planning focuses on external forces you can't control? How much energy gets spent trying to predict or influence things outside your boundary? How often do internal controllable factors get ignored because everyone's attention is on external noise? Deming's transformation of Ford started with this boundary clarity. Instead of trying to control supplier quality through inspection and rejection, Ford redesigned their supplier relationships to prevent defects from occurring. Instead of trying to motivate workers to care more, they redesigned information systems so workers could see the impact of their work immediately. Instead of trying to predict market demands perfectly, they built flexible manufacturing systems that could adapt quickly to changes. The focus shifted from managing external uncertainty to building internal capability. From controlling outcomes to designing systems that produced better outcomes naturally. From pushing harder to working smarter through structural advantage. The loop detective. Once you've mapped your system boundaries, the next step is identifying the feedback loops that operate within them. This is where most leaders discover that their intuitions about cause and effect are completely wrong. Reinforcing loops are the flywheels and death spirals of business. When they're working for you, they create compound advantages that accelerate over time. When they're working against you, they create compound problems that get worse without intervention. The key is learning to spot them early and design interventions that flip negative loops into positive ones. Balancing loops are the hidden brakes in your system. They're often disguised as resistance to change or people problems, but they're actually structural features that maintain stability. Sometimes you need to strengthen them to prevent chaos. Sometimes you need to weaken them to enable growth. The trick is understanding which type of loop you're dealing with. Netflix's recommendation system illustrates both types of loops working together. The reinforcing loop. Better recommendations increase viewing time, which generates more data, which enables better recommendations. The balancing loop. As content consumption increases, user satisfaction with recommendations must stay high to prevent churn, which constrains how aggressively the algorithm can push users toward new content. Understanding these loops allowed Netflix to optimize for long-term engagement rather than short-term metrics. They could see how pushing too hard on immediate viewing would trigger the balancing loop and reduce overall satisfaction. They could see how investing in recommendation quality would trigger the reinforcing loop and compound viewing over time. The delay trap. The most dangerous element in any causal system is delay, the time gap between cause and effect. Delays hide the connection between actions and outcomes, making it nearly impossible to learn from experience. They're the reason good strategies often look like failures early on, and bad strategies often look like successes until it's too late to change course. Most businesses operate with significant delays between strategic decisions and measurable results. Marketing campaigns take months to show ROI. Product development cycles stretch across quarters. Cultural changes unfold over years. During these delay periods, it's tempting to abandon good strategies that haven't shown results yet, or double down on bad strategies that are still showing positive momentum from earlier decisions. Deming's quality revolution at Ford took 3 years to show dramatic results, but the early indicators were visible much sooner for those who knew what to look for. Defect rates at individual stations, worker suggestions per month, time between problem identification and resolution. These leading indicators predicted the eventual transformation long before customer satisfaction scores reflected the change. The key is mapping delays explicitly and identifying leading indicators that predict lagging outcomes. This allows you to maintain confidence in good strategies during the inevitable rough patches and spot problems with bad strategies before they create irreversible damage. The leverage hunt. Not all nodes in a causal system are created equal. Some variables, when changed slightly, create cascading effects throughout the entire system. Others can be moved dramatically with minimal impact on anything else. Learning to distinguish between high-leverage and low-leverage intervention points is the difference between strategic breakthrough and tactical busy work. High-leverage points typically involve rules, incentives, information flows, and delays. Change the rules that govern behavior, and behavior changes automatically. Adjust the incentives that drive decisions, and decisions align with desired outcomes. Improve the information flows that enable learning, and learning accelerates across the system. Reduce the delays that hide cause and effect relationships, and feedback loops tighten. Amazon's obsession with reducing friction illustrates leverage thinking. Instead of trying to convince customers to buy more through marketing campaigns, they removed obstacles that prevented purchasing. One-click ordering, prime shipping, easy returns. Each friction reduction created a small improvement in conversion rates that compounded across millions of transactions. The leverage wasn't in any single improvement. It was in the systematic identification and elimination of friction points throughout the customer journey. This required mapping the causal system from initial awareness through repeat purchase, then identifying the specific nodes where small changes would have disproportionate impact. The implementation playbook. Building effective causal maps requires discipline and iteration. Start with the boundary box exercise to clarify your sphere of control. Pick one critical business engine, acquisition, retention, or operations, and map the key variables that drive performance in that area. Identify at least one reinforcing loop and one balancing loop within your chosen engine. Look for delays that might be hiding important cause and effect relationships. Circle the nodes where small changes could cascade through the system. These are your leverage points. Name your loops with memorable labels that stick in team conversations. The advocacy flywheel, the onboarding break, the quality spiral. Shared names create shared understanding and make it easier to spot patterns across different situations. Keep your map simple, 12 to 15 nodes maximum for a working diagram. Add complexity only when it's proven necessary for decision-making. The goal is insight, not comprehensiveness. You want maps that guide action, not academic exercises that impress observers. Validate the direction of your arrows with small tests. Correlation doesn't equal causation, so prove the causal links before building strategy around them. Remove arrows you can't justify with evidence or logic. The compound effect. When causal mapping works, the results compound quickly. You identify leverage points that create 10% or greater improvements in key metrics through small structural tweaks. Team decisions start referencing the shared map, reducing conflicts about priorities and resource allocation. Initiatives become more focused because everyone understands how individual projects connect to system-level outcomes. At the excellent level, you design new flywheels that create self-reinforcing advantage. Delays get shortened, accelerating learning cycles and feedback loops. At the best level, thinking in systems becomes the default mode for your culture, creating sustainable competitive advantage through superior system design. But beware the common failure modes. Overmapping creates diagram art that looks impressive but doesn't guide decisions. Blurry boundaries lead to wasted energy on uncontrollable factors. Loop blindness prevents recognition of feedback patterns that drive behavior. The solution is to stay focused on actionable insights. Map only what you plan to change. Keep boundaries crisp and revisit them quarterly. Ask what amplifies this and what dampens this to spot hidden loops. The hidden levers. Causal systems thinking reveals that most business problems aren't really problems. They're symptoms of structural issues that create the conditions for problems to emerge. When you change the structure, the symptoms disappear naturally without requiring constant management attention. This shift from symptom treatment to structure design is the foundation of strategic leverage. Instead of working harder within existing systems, you work smarter by redesigning the systems themselves. Instead of managing outcomes directly, you manage the conditions that produce outcomes. But seeing the system is only the beginning. Once you understand the causal forces at work in your business, you need to learn how to think several moves ahead, to anticipate the ripple effects of changes before you make them. The next chapter reveals how the most successful leaders use second-order thinking to outmaneuver competitors who only see the immediate consequences of their actions. Chapter 5, Second-Order Wins. Reed Hastings made a decision in 2007 that seemed insane to almost everyone watching. Netflix was dominating the DVD by mail market. Revenue was growing, customers were happy, Wall Street was pleased. The rational move was to optimize the existing business, improve logistics, expand the catalog, maybe reduce prices to fend off competitors. Instead, Hastings announced that Netflix would cannibalize its own success by shifting resources towards streaming video. The immediate reaction was predictable. Investors panicked, analysts downgraded the stock, competitors laughed. The first-order effects were brutal. Streaming had tiny margins, limited content, and technical challenges that made the service barely functional. By every visible metric, Hastings was destroying value. But he wasn't thinking about first-order effects. He was thinking about what would happen after what would happen. While everyone else saw streaming as a threat to the profitable DVD business, Hastings saw the second-order cascade that would reshape the entire entertainment industry. Streaming would eliminate shipping costs and inventory constraints. It would generate unprecedented data about viewing behavior. It would enable global expansion without physical infrastructure. Most importantly, it would create the foundation for original content that could compete with traditional studios. This is second-order thinking in action, the ability to see beyond immediate consequences to the ripple effects that determine long-term outcomes. And it's about to become your secret weapon for outmaneuvering competitors who only see one move ahead. The chess master's advantage. Most business leaders play checkers while thinking they're playing chess. They see the immediate consequences of their moves. Launch a product, hire a person, change a price, but miss the cascading effects that determine whether those moves create lasting advantage or temporary gains. Second-order thinking is the difference between tactics and strategy. Tactics focus on winning the current battle. Strategy focuses on positioning for the battles that haven't started yet. When you can see two moves ahead while competitors see only one, you gain the chess master's advantage, the ability to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term dominance. The challenge is that second-order effects are invisible when you make the initial decision. They emerge over time through the complex interactions between your actions and the systems they operate within. A pricing change doesn't just affect revenue, it signals value perception, influences customer acquisition costs, and shapes competitive responses. A hiring decision doesn't just add capacity, it changes team dynamics, shifts cultural norms, and alters the types of problems the organization can solve. These ripple effects often matter more than the direct effects, but they're harder to see and even harder to measure. They require a different kind of thinking, one that models consequences rather than just calculating immediate returns, one that considers timing, sequencing, and system dynamics rather than just isolated cause and effect. This is why some leaders consistently outperform others with similar resources. They're not necessarily smarter or more talented. They're thinking on a different time horizon and considering a broader range of consequences. They're playing a different game entirely. The cascade effect. Every business decision creates a cascade of consequences that ripple through interconnected systems. The key to second-order thinking is learning to trace these cascades before you trigger them, not after you're dealing with the unintended consequences. Consider what happens when you change your pricing strategy. The first-order effect is obvious. Revenue per customer goes up or down based on the price change and demand elasticity. But the second-order effects are where the real impact lives. Higher prices might improve profit margins, but also change the customer mix, attracting fewer price-sensitive buyers who might have become your best advocates. Lower prices might increase volume, but also signal lower value, making future price increases more difficult and potentially triggering competitive responses that erode everyone's margins. Netflix's streaming decision illustrates this cascade thinking perfectly. The first-order effect was negative: lower margins, technical challenges, limited content selection. But Hastings traced the second-order cascade. Streaming would generate viewing data that traditional media companies couldn't access. This data would enable better content recommendations, which would increase engagement and reduce churn. Higher engagement would justify higher subscription prices and attract more subscribers. More subscribers would provide the scale needed to invest in original content. Original content would differentiate Netflix from competitors and reduce dependence on licensed content from studios who were becoming competitors. Each step in the cascade created the conditions for the next step. The decision wasn't about streaming versus DVDs. It was about positioning Netflix to control its own destiny in a rapidly changing industry. The short-term pain was the price of long-term strategic advantage. The Leverage Hunter's Toolkit. Not all second-order effects are created equal. Some cascade through systems with exponential impact, while others dissipate quickly without creating lasting change. Learning to identify high-leverage intervention points is the difference between strategic breakthrough and incremental improvement. Leverage points exist where small changes in structure create large changes in behavior. These typically involve 4 key areas: rules that govern decisions, incentives that drive behavior, information flows that enable learning, and delays that hide cause and effect relationships. Rules are the most powerful leverage points because they shape every subsequent decision without requiring ongoing management attention. When Amazon established the rule that every internal team must expose their services through APIs, they weren't just improving technical architecture, they were creating the structural foundation for AWS, which became one of their most profitable business units. The rule forced teams to think about their work as products that others could use, which led to better design, clearer interfaces, and ultimately the ability to sell those services externally. Incentives are the second most powerful leverage points because they align individual behavior with organizational goals. But incentives must be designed carefully to avoid unintended consequences. When Wells Fargo incentivized account openings without considering the quality or legitimacy of those accounts, they created a cascade of fraudulent behavior that damaged the brand for years. The incentive structure optimized for the wrong metric and ignored the second-order effects on customer trust and regulatory compliance. Information flows create leverage by enabling faster learning and better decision-making throughout the organization. When Netflix started sharing detailed viewing data with content creators, they weren't just improving content quality, they were creating a competitive advantage in content acquisition and development. Studios that worked with Netflix could make better creative decisions, which led to more successful content, which attracted more viewers, which generated more data to share. The information flow created a virtuous cycle that benefited everyone in the ecosystem. Delays are often overlooked leverage points, but reducing them can dramatically accelerate learning and improvement cycles. When software companies moved from annual releases to continuous deployment, they didn't just ship features faster, they shortened the feedback loop between development and customer response. This enabled faster iteration, better product-market fit, and more responsive customer service. The delay reduction compounded into significant competitive advantage over time. The timing paradox. Second-order thinking isn't just about seeing consequences, it's about timing interventions to capture momentum rather than fighting against it. The same action can produce completely different results depending on when it's executed relative to other forces in the system. Hastings' streaming decision worked partly because of timing. He moved early enough to build infrastructure and content relationships before traditional media companies recognized the threat. If he had waited until streaming was obviously the future, the window for strategic advantage would have closed. If he had moved too early, before broadband infrastructure could support quality streaming, the technical challenges might have killed the initiative before it gained traction. This timing paradox appears throughout business strategy. Market entry timing affects competitive dynamics and customer adoption patterns. Hiring timing affects team culture and capability development. Investment timing affects resource availability and opportunity costs. The same strategic move can create advantage or disadvantage depending on its position in the sequence of industry evolution. The key is developing sensitivity to system momentum and positioning moves to ride favorable currents rather than swimming against them. This requires understanding not just what's happening now, but what's likely to happen next based on the forces already in motion. The two-move drill. Developing second-order thinking requires deliberate practice. The two-move drill forces you to trace consequences beyond immediate effects before making important decisions. Start by writing down the decision you're considering. Then identify the first-order effect, what happens immediately and directly as a result of this action. Next, trace the second-order effects at two time horizons, 90 days and 1 year. Consider both positive and negative cascades. What behaviors might change? What responses might competitors make? What new opportunities or constraints might emerge? For each potential second-order effect, assign a rough probability and impact assessment. This isn't about precise prediction, it's about expanding your consideration set beyond immediate consequences. The goal is to identify scenarios that could significantly affect the value of your decision, even if they're not certain to occur. The leverage scan exercise helps you identify the highest impact intervention points in your current systems. List the key rules, incentives, information flows, and delays that shape behavior in your organization. Rate each on a scale of 1 to 5, for small nudge creates big shift potential. Pick the top 2 and design minimal interventions that could test whether small changes create disproportionate effects. The delay map exercise reveals where time lags might be hiding important cause and effect relationships. Mark the places in your business where actions and results are separated by significant time delays. Adjust your expectations and review cadence to account for these delays. This prevents premature abandonment of good strategies that haven't had time to show results. The compound advantage. When second-order thinking becomes habitual, the advantages compound quickly. You avoid costly, unintended consequences that blindside competitors who only consider immediate effects. You identify leverage tweaks that lift core metrics by 15% or more with minimal additional investment. You redesign rules and incentives that compound improvements in retention, margin, or efficiency quarter over quarter. But the real advantage is strategic positioning. While competitors optimize for current conditions, you're building capabilities for future conditions. While they react to changes in the market, you're creating the changes that reshape the market. While they compete on efficiency within existing paradigms, you're designing new paradigms that make their efficiency irrelevant. This positioning advantage is self-reinforcing. Better strategic positioning leads to better financial performance, which provides more resources for strategic investment, which improves positioning further. The gap between first-order and second-order thinkers widens over time because the benefits of thinking ahead compound while the costs of thinking short-term accumulate. The execution challenge. Second-order thinking creates its own challenges. Analysis paralysis can emerge when you try to model too many future scenarios. Overconfidence can develop when your predictions prove accurate, leading to riskier bets based on false certainty. Delay blindness can cause you to abandon good strategies before they have time to work. The solution is disciplined execution within expanded thinking. Limit your analysis to 2 future steps, immediate effects and 1 level of cascade. Assign probability ranges rather than point predictions to maintain appropriate uncertainty. Build review checkpoints into your plans to track leading indicators of second-order effects. Most importantly, remember that second-order thinking is about improving decision quality, not achieving perfect prediction. The goal is to consider a broader range of consequences, not to forecast the future with certainty. Even imperfect second-order thinking beats perfect first-order thinking because it accounts for the systemic nature of business results. The strategic edge. Second-order thinking transforms how you approach every business decision. Instead of optimizing for immediate returns, you optimize for positioning and optionality. Instead of reacting to competitive moves, you anticipate them and prepare counter moves. Instead of managing symptoms, you design systems that prevent problems from emerging. This shift from reactive to proactive thinking is the foundation of sustainable competitive advantage. It's the difference between playing the game and changing the rules of the game. It's the difference between competing within existing constraints and redesigning the constraints themselves. But seeing 2 moves ahead is only valuable if you can execute those moves with precision and speed. The next chapter reveals how the most successful leaders translate strategic insight into tactical excellence, and why the quality of your decisions matters more than the quantity of your options. Chapter 6. Decision Logic. Warren Buffett was 26 years old when he made a decision that would define his entire investment philosophy. It was 1956, and Buffett had just returned to Omaha after working for his mentor, Benjamin Graham, in New York. He had $174,000 in capital and a choice to make: start his own investment partnership or take a safe job on Wall Street. Most young investors would have agonized over the decision, weighing pros and cons, seeking advice from mentors, maybe even flipping a coin. Buffett did something different. He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote down 3 columns: scenarios, probabilities, and expected outcomes. The math was simple but powerful. If the partnership succeeded, he could compound wealth at rates impossible as an employee. If it failed, he was young enough to recover and still had valuable skills. The probability of catastrophic failure was low because he would only invest in businesses he understood deeply. The probability of modest success was high because he had proven methods and would start small. The expected value calculation was clear: start the partnership. But here's what made Buffett different from other investors. He didn't just calculate expected value once and forget about it. He built a system for updating his beliefs as new evidence arrived. When investments worked, he analyzed why. When they failed, he studied the failure modes. When market conditions changed, he adjusted his probability assessments. This wasn't just decision-making, it was decision learning. That partnership became Berkshire Hathaway, one of the most successful investment vehicles in history. And the decision logic that launched it is about to transform how you approach every choice in your business. The opinion war problem. Most business decisions happen through opinion wars disguised as strategy sessions. Teams argue passionately about which direction to take, but they're really arguing about whose intuition should win. The loudest voice, the highest-ranking person, or the most charismatic presenter usually carries the day. Evidence gets cherry-picked to support predetermined positions. Uncertainty gets ignored because it's uncomfortable. This approach might work when stakes are low and decisions are easily reversible. But when resources are limited and consequences matter, opinion-based decision-making becomes a luxury you can't afford. You need a systematic way to compare options that doesn't depend on who argues most persuasively. The alternative is decision logic, a framework for translating messy, uncertain business situations into clear comparisons of expected outcomes. It's not about eliminating judgment or intuition. It's about making those judgments explicit and testable so you can improve them over time. Decision logic forces you to separate what you know from what you think you know. It makes assumptions visible so they can be challenged. It quantifies uncertainty instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Most importantly, it creates a learning system that gets better with each decision cycle. This isn't academic theory, it's practical advantage. When you can make better decisions faster, with less drama, you compound that advantage over time. Small edges in decision quality create large gaps in outcomes because business results are determined by the cumulative effect of hundreds of choices, not just the big strategic moves that get all the attention. The mathematics of choice. Expected value thinking is the foundation of decision logic. Instead of asking, what's the best case scenario, or what's the worst that could happen, you ask, what's the most likely weighted outcome across all scenarios? The calculation is straightforward. Multiply each possible outcome by its probability, then add them up. The option with the highest expected value wins. But the real power comes from making this process explicit and systematic, rather than leaving it buried in your subconscious. Consider a product launch decision. Option A is a safe incremental improvement with a 70% chance of generating $100,000 in additional revenue and a 30% chance of generating $50,000. Option B is a bold new feature with a 40% chance of generating $300,000, a 40% chance of generating $100,000, and a 20% chance of losing $50,000. Most teams would debate the merits of safe versus bold without ever quantifying what those terms mean. Expected value thinking cuts through the rhetoric. Option A has an expected value of $85,000. Option B has an expected value of $130,000. If these probability estimates are reasonable, option B is the better choice despite its higher risk. But here's where most people get expected value wrong. They treat it as a prediction rather than a decision tool. Expected value doesn't tell you what will happen. It tells you which bet to make given your current understanding of the probabilities. The actual outcome might be completely different from the expected value, and that's perfectly fine as long as your probability estimates were reasonable given the information available at decision time. Warren Buffett understood this distinction perfectly. He didn't expect every investment to generate exactly its expected return. He expected his portfolio of investments to generate superior returns over time because he consistently chose opportunities with positive expected value relative to their risk. The individual outcomes varied widely, but the systematic approach to decision-making created compound advantage. The update engine. Static decision-making is a recipe for obsolescence. Markets change, customer preferences shift, competitive dynamics evolve. The probability estimates that made sense 6 months ago might be completely wrong today. Without a systematic way to update your beliefs as new evidence arrives, you'll keep making decisions based on outdated assumptions. Bayesian updating provides a framework for changing your mind in proportion to the strength of new evidence. You start with a prior belief, your initial probability estimate based on available information. You define what signals would change your assessment. When those signals arrive, you update to a posterior belief that incorporates the new data. This sounds complicated, but it's actually how good decision makers think naturally. The key is making the process explicit so you can do it more systematically and avoid common biases that prevent proper updating. Netflix's approach to content investment illustrates Bayesian updating in action. They start with prior beliefs about what types of content will succeed based on viewing data, genre performance, and audience research. They define signals that would change their assessment, early viewing metrics, completion rates, social media engagement. As those signals arrive, they update their beliefs about the content's potential and adjust their marketing spend accordingly. This updating process happens continuously rather than at fixed intervals. When a show performs better than expected, they increase promotion and consider similar content. When a show underperforms, they reduce investment and update their models for future decisions. The content strategy evolves based on evidence rather than sticking rigidly to initial plans. The key insight is that changing your mind based on new evidence isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of intellectual honesty and strategic sophistication. The leaders who update their beliefs most effectively are the ones who make the best decisions over time because they're working with the most current information. The failure imagination exercise. Most decision-making focuses on success scenarios. How will this product launch go well? What's the best case for this hiring decision? How might this partnership create value? This optimistic bias is natural but dangerous because it prevents you from seeing failure modes until they're already happening. Inversion thinking flips this approach. Instead of asking how things will go right, you ask how they could go wrong. Instead of planning for success, you plan for failure. Instead of assuming your strategy will work, you assume it will fail and work backwards to understand why. This isn't pessimism, it's preparation. When you can see failure modes in advance, you can either avoid them entirely or build safeguards that limit their impact. When you can't see them, you're vulnerable to predictable problems that could have been prevented with better planning. Amazon's approach to new market entry demonstrates inversion thinking. Before entering a new geography or product category, they conduct pre-mortems, where teams imagine the expansion has failed and work backwards to identify the most likely causes. Regulatory challenges, cultural misunderstandings, operational complexity, competitive responses, each potential failure mode gets analyzed and addressed before launch. This process doesn't prevent all failures, but it prevents predictable failures and builds organizational capability for dealing with unexpected challenges. Teams develop contingency plans, early warning systems, and exit criteria before they're needed. When problems do arise, the response is faster and more effective because the failure modes have been anticipated. The inversion exercise forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about your strategy. Maybe your target market isn't as large as you assumed. Maybe your competitive advantage isn't as sustainable as you hoped. Maybe your execution capability isn't as strong as you believed. These realizations are painful but valuable because they allow course correction before resources are wasted. The counterfactual compass. Every decision involves opportunity cost, the value of the best alternative you're giving up. But most people focus on whether their chosen option is good rather than whether it's better than the alternatives. This leads to satisfactory decisions that miss superior opportunities. Counterfactual thinking forces explicit comparison with alternatives. Instead of asking, "Will this work?" you ask, "Will this work better than the next best option?" Instead of evaluating options in isolation, you evaluate them relative to each other. This comparative approach reveals hidden costs and benefits that aren't visible when options are considered separately. A product feature might seem valuable until you compare it to the alternative uses of the development time. A hiring decision might seem smart until you consider the opportunity cost of the salary and equity. A partnership might seem attractive until you compare it to organic growth alternatives. Buffett's investment decisions always involve explicit counterfactual analysis. He doesn't just ask whether a stock is undervalued, he asks whether it's more undervalued than other opportunities in his pipeline. He doesn't just consider whether a business is good, he considers whether it's better than keeping the money in cash or returning it to shareholders. This comparative approach ensures that capital gets allocated to the highest value opportunities rather than just acceptable ones. The counterfactual compass also helps with exit decisions. When should you stop investing in a struggling project? When should you pivot from a strategy that's not working? The answer isn't when the current path becomes bad, it's when alternative paths become better. This prevents sunk cost bias and keeps resources flowing toward the highest value opportunities. The implementation framework. Building decision logic into your organization requires systematic practice. Start with the expected value table exercise for important decisions. List your options, estimate upside and downside scenarios with rough probabilities, and calculate expected values. Don't worry about precision. The goal is structured comparison, not perfect prediction. Use probability ranges rather than point estimates to acknowledge uncertainty. Instead of saying 70% chance of success, say 60-80% chance of success. This prevents false precision while still enabling comparison between options. Separate reversible decisions from irreversible ones. Reversible decisions can be made quickly with less analysis because you can change course if you're wrong. Irreversible decisions deserve more scrutiny because the cost of error is higher. Amazon's Type 1 and Type 2 decision framework illustrates this distinction perfectly. Schedule review dates for important decisions. Don't just make the decision and move on. Plan when you'll revisit the choice based on new evidence. This prevents decision drift and ensures that changing circumstances trigger appropriate updates. Build the Bayesian updating process into your planning cycles. Start each quarter by reviewing your key assumptions and probability estimates. Identify what evidence would change your assessment. When that evidence arrives, update your beliefs and adjust your strategy accordingly. Create inversion sheets for major initiatives. List the top 3 ways the project could fail. Design mitigation strategies for each, and establish kill criteria that would trigger exit. This isn't about being negative, it's about being prepared. The compound effect. When decision logic becomes habitual, the advantages compound quickly. You cut low expected value projects before they consume resources. Decision latency decreases because you have a systematic framework for comparison. Portfolio performance improves because you're making more bets with positive expected value. At the excellent level, you start making more successful reversible decisions because the framework enables faster experimentation. Volatility decreases because you're better at avoiding predictable failures. At the best level, your win rate on irreversible decisions improves significantly because you're applying appropriate rigor to high-stakes choices. But beware the common failure modes. Fake precision creates the illusion of certainty where none exists. Use coarse probability buckets rather than precise percentages. Update inertia prevents belief revision when new evidence arrives. Calendar your review dates to force systematic updating. Optimism bias skews probability estimates toward favorable outcomes. Include pessimistic scenarios by default to counteract this tendency. The strategic advantage. Decision logic isn't just about making better individual choices. It's about building organizational capability for navigating uncertainty. When your team shares a common framework for evaluating options, debates become more productive and decisions become more consistent. When updating beliefs based on evidence becomes normal, the organization learns faster and adapts more effectively to changing conditions. This capability becomes a competitive advantage because most organizations make decisions through politics, intuition, and inherited wisdom rather than systematic analysis. When you can consistently make better choices with less drama and faster speed, you compound that advantage over time through superior resource allocation and strategic positioning. But decision logic is only valuable if you can execute those decisions effectively. The next chapter reveals how the most successful leaders turn strategic insights into operational reality, and why the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it determines the difference between good strategies and great results. Chapter 7, Test and Learn. Orville Wright was lying flat on his stomach, strapped to a wooden contraption that looked more like a torture device than a flying machine. It was December 14th, 1903, and the Wright brothers were about to attempt something that had defeated every well-funded aviation pioneer before them. Samuel Langley had just crashed his $70,000 government-sponsored aerodrome into the Potomac River 9 days earlier. The press was calling human flight impossible. Experts declared that heavier-than-air machines would never work. But the Wright brothers had something their competitors lacked: a systematic approach to turning beliefs into evidence. While others built grand machines based on theory and intuition, the Wrights built small, cheap tests. They started with kites, then gliders, then a wind tunnel made from a wooden box and a fan. Each experiment was designed to answer one specific question. Does this wing shape generate more lift? Does this control surface improve stability? Does this engine produce enough thrust? Most importantly, they defined failure criteria before each test. If the wing didn't generate X amount of lift at Y speed, they would abandon that design and try something else. If the control system didn't respond within Z seconds, they would redesign it. No emotional attachment, no sunk cost bias, just evidence and iteration. That systematic approach to testing is what put Orville in the air for 12 seconds on December 17, 1903, while better-funded competitors were still arguing about theories, and it's about to transform how you approach every assumption in your business. The assumption epidemic. Your business is built on a foundation of untested beliefs. You believe customers want certain features. You believe your pricing strategy is optimal. You believe your marketing messages resonate with your target audience. You believe your operational processes are efficient. Most of these beliefs are probably wrong, but you won't know which ones until you test them. The problem isn't that you have assumptions. Assumptions are inevitable when you're operating under uncertainty. The problem is that these assumptions stay hidden, unexamined, and untested until they cause expensive failures. By then, you've already committed resources, built processes, and created momentum around ideas that don't work. This assumption epidemic creates a culture of opinion warfare where the loudest voice wins instead of the best evidence. Teams spend weeks debating which approach will work instead of spending days testing to find out. Decisions get delayed while everyone argues about unknowable futures instead of creating small experiments that reveal actual customer behavior. The alternative is a culture of evidence where assumptions become hypotheses, hypotheses become tests, and tests become knowledge. This isn't about eliminating uncertainty. It's about reducing uncertainty systematically and cheaply before making big bets. It's about turning the unknown into the known through deliberate experimentation rather than expensive trial and error. The Wright brothers understood this principle intuitively. They didn't argue about whether their wing design would work. They built a small version and tested it. They didn't debate whether their control system was optimal. They tried it and measured the results. They didn't theorize about engine power requirements. They calculated the minimum thrust needed and built an engine to meet that specification. This systematic approach to learning gave them a massive advantage over competitors who were still operating on intuition and inherited wisdom. While others were building expensive prototypes based on untested theories, the Wrights were accumulating validated knowledge through cheap, fast experiments. The minimum viable truth. The key to effective testing is finding the smallest experiment that can meaningfully change your belief about something important. This is the concept of the minimum viable hypothesis, the cheapest, fastest way to gather evidence that could prove you wrong. Most business experiments are too big, too slow, and too expensive. Teams want to test everything at once instead of isolating individual variables. They want perfect conditions instead of quick feedback. They want comprehensive data instead of directional signals. This approach turns testing into a major project instead of a daily habit. The MVH approach flips this thinking. Instead of asking, how can we test this completely, you ask, what's the smallest thing we could test that would change our mind? Instead of designing elaborate experiments, you design simple ones. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, you test under current constraints. Consider a common business assumption. Our customers will pay more for premium features. Instead of building a full premium product and launching it to see what happens, you could test this assumption with a simple pricing page experiment. Show different price points to different visitor segments and measure conversion rates. The test takes days instead of months, costs hundreds instead of thousands, and gives you directional evidence about price sensitivity. The beauty of the MVH approach is that it makes testing accessible and routine instead of special and rare. When tests are small and cheap, you can run many of them. When you run many tests, you learn faster. When you learn faster, you make better decisions. When you make better decisions, you compound advantage over competitors who are still guessing. But the real power comes from the discipline of falsifiability, defining exactly what evidence would prove your hypothesis wrong before you start testing. This prevents the natural human tendency to interpret ambiguous results as confirmation of what you already believed. The falsification firewall. The most dangerous bias in business is confirmation bias, the tendency to seek evidence that supports what you already believe while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. This bias is so strong that it can turn testing into an elaborate exercise in self-deception. You'll unconsciously design tests that are likely to confirm your assumptions, interpret ambiguous results favorably, and dismiss negative results as anomalies. Falsification thinking provides a firewall against this bias by forcing you to define disproof criteria before you start testing. Instead of asking, how can we prove this works, you ask, what would prove this doesn't work? Instead of looking for confirmation, you look for contradiction. Instead of trying to validate your assumptions, you try to invalidate them. This approach seems counterintuitive, but it's actually more likely to reveal truth because it forces intellectual honesty. When you define failure criteria in advance, you can't move the goalposts when results don't match expectations. When you commit to stopping if certain thresholds aren't met, you can't rationalize continuing with a failed approach. The Wright brothers were masters of falsification thinking. They didn't just test whether their designs worked. They defined exactly what working meant before each experiment. If a wing design didn't generate a specific amount of lift at a specific speed, they abandoned it regardless of how much time they had invested in the concept. If a control system didn't respond within a specific time frame, they redesigned it even if they were emotionally attached to the original approach. This discipline allowed them to kill bad ideas quickly and focus their energy on promising directions. While competitors were persisting with flawed approaches because they couldn't admit failure, the Wrights were iterating rapidly towards solutions that actually worked. The falsification firewall also creates psychological safety for experimentation. When failure is defined clearly and accepted as a normal part of the learning process, teams become more willing to test risky ideas. When success criteria are explicit, there's less ambiguity about whether an experiment worked. When kill criteria are established in advance, stopping a failed test feels like following the plan rather than admitting defeat. The evidence engine. Testing isn't just about individual experiments, it's about building an organizational capability for systematic learning. The most successful companies don't just run occasional tests when they're uncertain about something. They build testing into their regular operating rhythm so that learning happens continuously rather than sporadically. This requires shifting from project-based testing to process-based testing. Instead of treating experiments as special events, you treat them as normal business operations. Instead of testing only when you're uncertain, you test to stay ahead of changing conditions. Instead of testing individual assumptions in isolation, you test systematically across all areas of the business. Amazon exemplifies this approach with their culture of continuous experimentation. They don't just test new features before launching them. They test existing features to see if they can be improved. They don't just test marketing messages. They test operational processes, pricing strategies, and organizational structures. They don't just test when they're uncertain. They test to discover opportunities they didn't know existed. This systematic approach to testing creates compound learning advantages. Each experiment generates knowledge that informs future experiments. Each validated principle becomes part of the organizational playbook. Each failed test eliminates approaches that don't need to be tried again. Over time, the organization accumulates a library of validated knowledge that guides decision-making and reduces uncertainty. The evidence engine also changes how teams think about failure. Instead of seeing failed tests as wasted effort, they see them as valuable information that prevents larger failures. Instead of avoiding uncertainty, they seek it out as an opportunity to gain advantage through superior knowledge. Instead of relying on intuition and best practices, they rely on evidence and validated principles. The scaling gateway. One of the biggest mistakes in business is scaling unvalidated ideas. Teams get excited about a concept, build it out completely, launch it broadly, and then discover that customers don't want it or that the economics don't work. By then, significant resources have been wasted and momentum has been lost. The scaling gateway prevents this mistake by requiring validation at small scale before allowing expansion to large scale. Ideas must pass through multiple testing phases, each with specific success criteria, before they earn the right to consume significant resources. The first gate is proof of concept. Can you demonstrate that the basic idea works under controlled conditions? This might be a simple prototype, a small pilot program, or a limited market test. The success criteria are usually qualitative. Does the solution address the intended problem? Do early users respond positively? Are there any obvious fatal flaws? The second gate is proof of viability. Can you demonstrate that the idea works under realistic conditions with acceptable economics? This requires testing with real customers, real constraints, and real competitive pressures. The success criteria become quantitative, specific conversion rates, retention metrics, or unit economics that must be achieved. The third gate is proof of scalability. Can you demonstrate that the idea maintains its effectiveness as volume increases? This tests whether the solution works with larger customer segments, higher transaction volumes, or more complex operational requirements. The success criteria focus on maintaining quality and economics at scale. Each gate requires independent validation before proceeding to the next level. This prevents the natural tendency to rationalize marginal results or to assume that problems will resolve themselves at larger scale. It also creates natural stopping points where failed ideas can be abandoned before consuming significant resources. Netflix uses this gating approach for content investment decisions. New show concepts start with small pilot episodes that test audience interest and production feasibility. Shows that pass the pilot gate get limited season orders with specific viewership and engagement targets. Only shows that demonstrate strong performance at limited scale earn renewal for additional seasons or expanded marketing investment. The implementation playbook. Building effective testing capability requires systematic practice and clear frameworks. Start with the MVH card exercise for important assumptions. Write your hypothesis in the format if X, then Y by Z metric. Define the specific metric and threshold that would falsify the hypothesis. Establish the method and timeframe for gathering evidence. The kill switch exercise forces pre-commitment to stopping criteria. Define the exact signal that would trigger abandonment of the test or idea. Document this threshold before starting the experiment. Celebrate the save when you stop a failed test rather than mourning the sunk cost. The scaling gate exercise creates checkpoints that prevent premature expansion. Require 2 independent validations before moving from concept to pilot and from pilot to full implementation. Add guardrail metrics that must be maintained even if primary metrics improve. Document validated principles that emerge from successful tests. Keep tests boring and focused on clean signal rather than impressive presentations. Test the riskiest assumption first rather than the easiest one. Archive failed tests to prevent teams from accidentally repeating experiments that have already been proven ineffective. Use behavior-based metrics rather than vanity metrics that can be gamed or misinterpreted. Ensure that sample sizes and test duration are sufficient to detect meaningful effect sizes. Freeze success and failure thresholds in writing to prevent moving goalposts when results are disappointing. The compound learning effect. When testing becomes systematic, the advantages compound rapidly. You kill risky assumptions quickly, saving weeks or months of misdirected effort. You validate promising approaches and integrate them into operations with measured performance improvements. You develop organizational capability for rapid learning that creates sustainable competitive advantage. At the excellent level, you establish weekly testing cadence where learning velocity becomes clearly visible. Teams become comfortable with uncertainty because they have reliable methods for reducing it. Decision-making improves because it's based on evidence rather than opinion. At the best level, testing culture becomes self-reinforcing. New team members learn the discipline quickly because it's embedded in daily operations. Innovation accelerates because ideas can be tested quickly and cheaply. Strategic advantage compounds because the organization learns faster than competitors. But beware the common failure modes. Moving goalposts destroys the integrity of the testing process. Vanity metrics create the illusion of progress without real behavioral change. Underpowered tests generate noise instead of signal, leading to false conclusions. The strategic advantage. Testing culture isn't just about reducing uncertainty, it's about building organizational capability for navigating change. When your team can quickly distinguish between ideas that work and ideas that don't, you can adapt faster to changing market conditions. When you can validate assumptions cheaply before making big bets, you can take more calculated risks. When you can learn from failures without catastrophic consequences, you can innovate more boldly. This capability becomes a competitive moat because most organizations still operate on intuition, politics, and inherited wisdom rather than systematic experimentation. When you can consistently make decisions based on evidence while competitors are still guessing, you compound that advantage over time through superior resource allocation and strategic positioning. But testing is only valuable if you can identify the real constraints that limit your growth and focus your experimental energy where it matters most. The next chapter reveals how to find the true bottlenecks in your system and why optimizing everything except the constraint is the most expensive mistake you can make. Chapter 8. Bottleneck Flow. Jeff Bezos was obsessed with something that seemed trivial to most retail executives. It was 1997, and Amazon was still primarily a bookstore. While competitors focused on inventory selection, marketing campaigns, and profit margins, Bezos spent hours analyzing something much more mundane: how long it took customers to complete a purchase. He tracked every click, every page load, every moment of friction in the buying process. His team thought he was missing the big picture. Books were commodities. Success would come from having the best selection, the lowest prices, or the smartest marketing. But Bezos saw something different. He saw that convenience wasn't just a nice-to-have feature, it was the constraint that determined everything else. While other retailers were optimizing inventory turns and gross margins, Bezos was optimizing for what he called customer obsession. But this wasn't feel-good corporate speak. It was a systematic approach to identifying and eliminating the bottlenecks that prevented customers from buying more often, with less friction. That obsession with flow led to one-click ordering, which led to prime shipping, which led to AWS infrastructure, which led to marketplace expansion. Each breakthrough came from the same principle: find the constraint that limits throughput, then elevate it methodically. Don't optimize everything. Optimize the one thing that matters most. This is bottleneck thinking in action, and it's about to reveal why most of your improvement efforts are creating the illusion of progress while leaving your real constraints untouched. The everywhere optimization trap. Most businesses suffer from improvement ADD. Teams launch efficiency initiatives in every department simultaneously. Marketing optimizes conversion rates, while sales optimizes close rates, while operations optimizes delivery times, while finance optimizes cash flow. Everyone's busy improving something, but overall performance stays flat. This scattered approach feels productive because there's always measurable progress somewhere. Marketing can report higher click-through rates. Sales can show shorter sales cycles. Operations can demonstrate faster fulfillment. Finance can point to improved working capital metrics. But these local optimizations often cancel each other out or create new bottlenecks elsewhere in the system. The fundamental insight that most leaders miss is that system performance is determined by the slowest component, not the average performance of all components. If your sales team can close deals faster, but your delivery team can't fulfill them, customers get frustrated and churn increases. If your marketing team generates more leads, but your sales team can't handle the volume, conversion rates drop and cost per acquisition rises. This is why the theory of constraints is so powerful. It forces you to think about your business as a connected system rather than a collection of independent functions. In any system, there's always one constraint that limits overall throughput. Everything else is either feeding that constraint or being fed by it. Until you elevate the constraint, improvements elsewhere are largely cosmetic. Amazon's early focus on purchase convenience illustrates this principle perfectly. While competitors were optimizing inventory selection and pricing, Amazon identified that the real constraint was customer friction during the buying process. People knew what they wanted to buy. The bottleneck was making it easy for them to complete the transaction. By obsessing over this constraint, Amazon created a competitive advantage that persisted even when competitors matched their selection and pricing. The hidden constraint hunt. Finding your real constraint requires detective work because the obvious bottleneck is rarely the actual bottleneck. Teams naturally focus on the loudest problems, the squeaky wheels that generate the most complaints. But the true constraint is often operating quietly in the background, invisible until you map the entire flow. The constraint hunt starts with mapping your core value stream from initial customer contact through final delivery and payment. This isn't an org chart exercise. It's a flow analysis that traces how work actually moves through your system. Where do things pile up? Where do handoffs create delays? Where do quality issues force rework? Where do capacity limitations create queues? The real constraint reveals itself through three signals: queue length, wait time, and work-in-process accumulation. The constraint is where work backs up because downstream capacity can't keep pace with upstream demand. It's where cycle times stretch because resources are overloaded. It's where small problems create disproportionate delays because there's no buffer capacity to absorb variation. But here's where most constraint identification goes wrong. Teams confuse symptoms with causes. They see long wait times in customer service and assume customer service is the constraint. They see quality issues in manufacturing and assume manufacturing is the constraint. They see slow sales cycles and assume sales is the constraint. But these symptoms often point to upstream constraints that create the conditions for downstream problems. Amazon's constraint analysis revealed that purchase friction wasn't actually caused by the checkout process itself. It was caused by uncertainty about delivery timing, return policies, and product quality. Customers hesitated to buy because they weren't confident about the post-purchase experience. The real constraint was trust, not technology. This insight led to innovations like customer reviews, detailed return policies, and eventually Prime's delivery guarantee. The elevation methodology. Once you've identified the true constraint, the temptation is to throw resources at it immediately. More people, more technology, more budget, whatever it takes to eliminate the bottleneck. But this approach often backfires because it doesn't address the root causes that created the constraint in the first place. The theory of constraints provides a systematic methodology for constraint elevation that prevents these mistakes. First, exploit the constraint by maximizing its utilization with existing resources. Eliminate waste, reduce setup times, improve quality, and ensure the constraint never sits idle. This often produces significant improvement without additional investment. Second, subordinate everything else to the constraint. This means adjusting upstream and downstream processes to support optimal constraint performance rather than optimizing them independently. It means accepting that non-constraint resources will have idle time because keeping them busy would actually hurt overall system performance. Third, elevate the constraint by adding capacity through investment in people, technology, or process redesign, but only after you've maximized the value of existing capacity through exploitation and subordination. This ensures that new investment creates real throughput improvement rather than just shifting the constraint elsewhere. Fourth, repeat the process because elevating one constraint always reveals the next constraint. This isn't a one-time fix. It's an ongoing discipline of continuous constraint identification and elevation. The goal isn't to eliminate all constraints. That's impossible. The goal is to ensure that your constraint is the one you choose rather than one that emerges by accident. Amazon's approach to logistics illustrates this methodology perfectly. They started by exploiting existing warehouse capacity through better inventory placement and picking optimization. They subordinated purchasing and vendor management to support faster fulfillment. They elevated capacity through new distribution centers and automation technology. Then they repeated the process, identifying new constraints in last-mile delivery that led to innovations like Amazon Logistics and drone delivery experiments. The complex versus complicated distinction. Not all constraints are created equal. Some exist in complicated systems where cause and effect are clear and best practices can be applied reliably. Others exist in complex systems where cause and effect are unclear and solutions must be discovered through experimentation. Applying the wrong approach to the wrong type of constraint wastes time and resources. Complicated constraints respond well to process improvement, standardization, and efficiency optimization. These are the constraints where you can define best practices, measure performance precisely, and predict the impact of changes. Manufacturing bottlenecks, software deployment pipelines, and financial reporting processes typically fall into this category. Complex constraints require adaptive approaches that emphasize sensing, probing, and responding to emergent patterns. These are the constraints where cause and effect are unclear, where best practices don't exist, and where solutions must be discovered rather than implemented. Customer acquisition, team collaboration, and innovation processes typically fall into this category. The key insight is that complex constraints can't be solved with complicated solutions. You can't process engineer your way to better customer relationships. You can't standardize your way to breakthrough innovation. You can't measure your way to improved team dynamics. These constraints require different tools, experimentation, feedback loops, and adaptive learning rather than optimization and control. Amazon's approach to content recommendation illustrates this distinction. The technical infrastructure for serving recommendations is a complicated system that benefits from optimization and standardization, but the algorithms that determine what to recommend operate in a complex system where customer preferences, content quality, and contextual factors interact in unpredictable ways. Amazon treats these as different types of constraints requiring different approaches. The capital allocation compass. Constraint thinking transforms how you allocate resources because it makes opportunity cost visible. Every dollar spent on non-constraint improvement is a dollar not spent on constraint elevation. Every hour of management attention focused on non-constraint optimization is an hour not focused on constraint breakthrough. This doesn't mean you ignore everything except the constraint. Non-constraint resources still need maintenance, quality control, and incremental improvement. But it means you resist the temptation to over-optimize non-constraints while the real constraint remains unaddressed. It means accepting that some parts of your system will operate below their theoretical maximum efficiency because pushing them harder would actually hurt overall performance. The cost of delay framework helps quantify these trade-offs by putting a dollar value on constraint-related delays. How much revenue do you lose each week that the constraint remains unresolved? How much does customer satisfaction decline? How much does competitive advantage erode? These calculations make it easier to justify constraint-focused investment and resist pressure to spread resources across multiple improvement initiatives. Amazon's investment in Prime illustrates this capital allocation discipline. The program required massive upfront investment in logistics infrastructure and ongoing subsidies for shipping costs. From a traditional ROI perspective, many of these investments looked questionable, but from a constraint perspective, they made perfect sense because they addressed the fundamental bottleneck that limited customer lifetime value, delivery convenience, and predictability. The flow state achievement. When constraint thinking becomes systematic, something remarkable happens. Instead of managing a collection of independent optimization projects, you start managing flow. Instead of celebrating local improvements that don't affect overall performance, you celebrate throughput increases that compound over time. Instead of fighting fires and managing exceptions, you design systems that prevent problems from emerging. This shift from optimization thinking to flow thinking changes how teams operate. They start asking different questions. Will this improvement help the constraint? Instead of, will this improvement help my department? They start measuring different metrics. Did overall throughput increase? Instead of, did my function's efficiency improve? They start collaborating differently. How can we support the constraint? Instead of, how can we optimize our piece? The compound effect of flow thinking is dramatic. Cycle times decrease because work moves smoothly through the system without accumulating in queues. Quality improves because problems get caught and fixed closer to their source. Predictability increases because variability gets absorbed by non-constraint buffers rather than propagating throughout the system. Customer satisfaction rises because delivery becomes more reliable and responsive. But the real breakthrough comes when you design new capacity that unlocks growth flywheels rather than just solving current problems. When Amazon elevated their logistics constraint through Prime, they didn't just improve delivery times, they created a platform for subscription revenue, marketplace expansion, and digital services. The constraint elevation became the foundation for entirely new business models. The implementation discipline. Building constraint-focused capability requires systematic practice and organizational discipline. Start with the constraint hunt exercise by mapping your core value stream and identifying where work accumulates. Validate your hypothesis with data on queue lengths, wait times, and work-in-process levels. Confirm the constraint by making a small improvement and measuring the system-wide impact. Implement the exploit subordinate elevate methodology by maximizing current constraint utilization before adding new capacity. Resist the temptation to optimize non-constraints while the real constraint remains unaddressed. Declare one primary constraint per quarter and align all improvement efforts around elevating it. Use the cost of delay framework to prioritize projects based on their impact on constraint performance rather than their local benefits. Review these priorities monthly to ensure focus remains on the activities that actually improve throughput. Guard constraint capacity by protecting it from non-essential work and interruptions. Distinguish between complex and complicated constraints by assessing whether cause and effect relationships are clear and predictable. Apply process improvement approaches to complicated constraints and adaptive experimentation approaches to complex constraints. Don't mix the playbooks. The systematic advantage. When bottleneck thinking becomes habitual, the advantages compound rapidly. Cycle times decrease by 10 to 20% as flow improves through constraint elevation. Cost of delay gets halved as predictability increases and variability decreases. New capacity unlocks growth opportunities that create sustainable competitive advantage. At the excellent level, you develop the ability to identify and elevate constraints faster than they can emerge, creating smooth flow that adapts to changing conditions. At the best level, constraint thinking becomes the foundation for designing entirely new business models that turn traditional industry constraints into competitive advantages. But constraint identification and elevation is only the beginning of strategic leverage. Once you understand how to optimize flow through your current system, you need to learn how to stack all these principles into a compound advantage engine that gets stronger over time. The final chapter reveals how the most successful leaders integrate everything you've learned into a living system that creates exponential returns on strategic thinking. Chapter 9, Compound Advantage. Steve Jobs was dying, and he knew it. It was 2010, and the pancreatic cancer that would claim his life the following year was already reshaping how he thought about Apple's future. Most CEOs in his position would have focused on succession planning, legacy preservation, or maximizing short-term value. Jobs did something different. He spent his remaining energy building what he called the machine that builds the machine, a system of principles so deeply embedded in Apple's DNA that they would continue generating breakthrough products long after he was gone. The principles weren't complicated. Ruthless simplicity in design, end-to-end integration across hardware and software, obsessive attention to user experience, constraint-driven innovation that turned limitations into advantages, second-order thinking about ecosystem effects, relentless testing and iteration until products reached an almost impossible standard of excellence. But here's what made Jobs different from other visionary leaders. He didn't just practice these principles, he stacked them into a self-reinforcing system where each principle amplified the others. Simplicity drove integration, which enabled better user experience, which justified premium pricing, which funded more ambitious innovation, which created stronger ecosystem lock-in, which supported even higher prices. The principles compounded into competitive advantages that competitors still struggle to replicate more than a decade later. This is the ultimate payoff of strategic thinking, building a machine that generates exponential returns on every decision, every constraint, every test, every insight. You've learned the individual principles. Now it's time to stack them into compound advantage. The strategic operating system. Everything you've learned in this book is designed to work together as an integrated system. First principles decomposition reveals the atomic elements of your business. Constraint design focuses your energy on what matters most. Causal systems thinking shows you how those elements interact. Second-order scanning helps you anticipate ripple effects. Decision logic ensures you choose the highest expected value paths. Test and learn validates your assumptions before you scale them. Bottleneck flow maximizes throughput through your most important constraints. Each principle is powerful on its own, but the real magic happens when they reinforce each other. When you decompose a problem to its primitives, you often discover constraints you didn't know existed. When you map causal systems, you identify leverage points for second-order effects. When you think second-order, you design better tests. When you test systematically, you find bottlenecks faster. When you elevate bottlenecks, you create capacity for more ambitious experiments. This isn't just additive improvement, it's multiplicative advantage. Each principle makes the others more effective. Each cycle through the system upgrades your capability to execute the next cycle. Each validated insight becomes part of your organizational playbook, reducing the need to resolve problems you've already figured out. The compound effect emerges because strategic thinking becomes habitual rather than occasional. Instead of applying these principles only to major decisions, you apply them to daily choices. Instead of using them only when you're stuck, you use them to stay ahead of problems. Instead of treating them as special tools for special situations, you treat them as the normal way of operating. This transformation from event-based strategy to system-based strategy is what separates good companies from great ones. Good companies have smart strategies. Great companies have strategic systems that generate smart strategies continuously. The leadership transformation. When you master these principles, something fundamental changes about how you lead. The frantic energy of firefighting gets replaced by the calm confidence of systematic thinking. The drama of opinion wars gets replaced by the clarity of evidence-based decisions. The stress of constant uncertainty gets replaced by the peace of knowing you have reliable methods for reducing uncertainty. This isn't about becoming emotionless or mechanical. It's about channeling your passion and intuition through frameworks that amplify their effectiveness. Your gut instincts become hypotheses to test rather than facts to defend. Your vision becomes a constraint that guides decisions rather than a dream that floats above reality. Your urgency becomes focused energy rather than scattered motion. The signal-to-noise ratio in your decision-making improves dramatically. You stop wasting time on low-leverage activities because you can identify high-leverage opportunities faster. You stop getting distracted by competitive moves because you're focused on your own constraint elevation. You stop second-guessing yourself because your decisions are based on evidence and systematic analysis rather than hope and intuition. This clarity creates a positive feedback loop in your leadership effectiveness. Better decisions lead to better results, which create more resources for strategic investment, which enable even better decisions. Your team's confidence in your judgment increases because they can see the logic behind your choices. Your own confidence increases because you have reliable methods for navigating uncertainty. The compound effect extends beyond individual decisions to your entire approach to building and scaling a business. You start designing systems that work without your constant intervention. You start building capabilities that improve automatically through use. You start creating cultures that learn and adapt faster than competitors can copy. The relationship revolution. Strategic thinking transforms not just how you make decisions, but how you work with others. When your team shares a common framework for analyzing problems, debates become more productive because everyone's arguing from the same logical foundation. When your principles are explicit and consistent, trust builds faster because people can predict how you'll respond to different situations. The shared maps created through causal systems thinking eliminate most political arguments about priorities and resource allocation. Instead of fighting over whose opinion should win, teams collaborate to optimize the system they all understand. Instead of defending departmental interests, people focus on elevating the constraints that limit overall performance. This shift from politics to principles creates psychological safety for experimentation and honest feedback. When failure is defined clearly through falsification criteria, people become more willing to take calculated risks. When updating beliefs based on evidence is celebrated rather than seen as weakness, learning accelerates throughout the organization. Your relationships with stakeholders, investors, customers, partners, suppliers also improve because you can make and keep more predictable promises. When your constraints are clear, you know what you can and can't deliver. When your testing is systematic, you can provide realistic timelines and expectations. When your decision logic is sound, you can explain your reasoning in ways that build confidence rather than confusion. The credibility that comes from consistent delivery compounds over time. Stakeholders start giving you the benefit of the doubt when problems arise because they've seen you solve problems systematically before. They start bringing you better opportunities because they trust your ability to evaluate and execute them effectively. They start investing more resources in the relationship because they see it as a source of sustainable advantage rather than transactional exchange. The execution engine. The ultimate test of strategic thinking is execution. All the frameworks in the world are worthless if they don't translate into better results in the real world. This is where the compound advantage becomes most visible, in your ability to ship fewer, smarter bets that create disproportionate value. When you can identify and test your riskiest assumptions quickly, you avoid wasting months on projects that were never going to work. When you can spot bottlenecks before they become critical, you maintain smooth flow even as you scale. When you can think second order about competitive responses, you build moats that get stronger over time rather than weaker. The portfolio approach to decision-making means you're not betting everything on single big moves. Instead, you're making many smaller bets with positive expected value, knowing that the portfolio will generate superior returns even if individual bets fail. This approach reduces risk while increasing upside potential because you can afford to take more calculated risks. The systematic approach to constraint elevation means you're always working on the thing that matters most for overall performance. Instead of spreading effort across multiple improvement initiatives, you're concentrating force where it can create the biggest impact. This focus multiplies the effectiveness of every hour and dollar you invest in improvement. Most importantly, you develop the ability to step back from daily operations without slowing down organizational momentum. The systems you've built can run without your constant intervention because the principles are embedded in processes, metrics, and culture. This creates the freedom to focus on vision, strategy, and partnerships rather than firefighting and micromanagement. The learning flywheel. The most powerful aspect of this approach is how it accelerates learning over time. Each cycle through the strategic thinking process upgrades your capability to execute the next cycle. Each validated principle becomes part of your organizational playbook. Each failed test eliminates approaches you don't need to try again. This creates a cultural flywheel where testing leads to updating, which leads to principle stacking, which leads to momentum, which enables more ambitious testing. New team members absorb this operating system quickly because it's embedded in how work gets done, rather than existing as abstract concepts in training materials. The system becomes self-teaching because the principles are designed to surface and correct their own limitations. When assumptions prove wrong, the testing framework catches it quickly. When constraints shift, the bottleneck focus methodology identifies new leverage points. When second-order effects surprise you, the causal mapping process helps you understand why and adjust accordingly. This adaptive capability becomes a sustainable competitive advantage because it's much harder to copy than any individual product or strategy. Competitors can reverse engineer your current offerings, but they can't reverse engineer your ability to continuously improve those offerings through systematic thinking. The compound returns on this investment in learning capability are extraordinary. The same effort produces higher yields because your methods get more sophisticated. Friction falls throughout the organization because people know how to work together effectively. Throughput climbs because bottlenecks get identified and elevated faster. The Jobs Standard. Steve Jobs exemplified this approach to compound advantage through principle stacking. His invariant of end-to-end integration wasn't just a design philosophy, it was a constraint that shaped every business decision. His obsession with simplicity wasn't just aesthetic preference, it was a systematic approach to eliminating complexity that didn't serve users. The second-order thinking that created the iPhone ecosystem demonstrates how these principles compound. Jobs didn't just think about building a better phone. He thought about how a better phone could create a platform for software, services, and accessories. He didn't just optimize individual products, he optimized the interactions between products to create switching costs and network effects. The tight feedback loops between design, engineering, and marketing at Apple show how organizational structure can amplify strategic principles. Instead of optimizing each function independently, Jobs subordinated everything to the constraint of creating products that customers would love enough to pay premium prices for. The principal stacking created moats that competitors still struggle to cross. The integration between hardware and software creates performance advantages that pure software or pure hardware companies can't match. The ecosystem effects create switching costs that make customers reluctant to leave even when individual products have superior alternatives. The brand premium enables investment in R&D that maintains technological leadership. This is what compound advantage looks like in practice, a system of reinforcing principles that creates exponential returns on strategic thinking. Your first move. The journey from tactical thinking to strategic advantage starts with 3 concrete actions you can take today. First, write your invariant list, 5 non-negotiable rules that will guide every decision in your business. These aren't aspirational values or marketing slogans. They're operational constraints that you're willing to sacrifice short-term gains to protect. Tie each invariant to a specific metric so you can track whether you're actually living by these principles. Share this list with your team today and start using it to filter opportunities and priorities. Second, convert your biggest assumption into a minimum viable hypothesis card. Write it in the format, if X, then Y by Z metric. Define the specific threshold that would falsify your hypothesis. Establish the method and time frame for gathering evidence. Calendar the review date and pre-commit to the kill criteria. This single test will demonstrate the power of systematic experimentation and build momentum for broader adoption of evidence-based decision-making. Third, schedule a 45-minute expected value analysis for your next big decision. List your options, estimate upside and downside scenarios with rough probabilities, and calculate expected values. Don't worry about precision. The goal is structured comparison that makes trade-offs visible. Document your reasoning and set a review date to track how the decision plays out. This exercise will immediately improve your decision quality and create a template for future choices. These 3 actions might seem small, but they're the seeds of compound advantage. Each one establishes a habit that will compound over time. Each one creates a foundation for applying the other principles you've learned. Each one starts the transformation from reactive management to proactive strategy. The exponential future. The principles in this book aren't just tools for improving your current business. They're the foundation for building businesses that create exponential value over time. When you can systematically identify and test assumptions, you can adapt faster to changing market conditions. When you can design and elevate constraints, you can create competitive advantages that get stronger rather than weaker over time. When you can think second order about system effects, you can build flywheels that compound momentum automatically. This capability becomes more valuable as the pace of change accelerates. The businesses that thrive in uncertain environments aren't the ones with the best current strategies. They're the ones with the best strategic thinking systems. They're the ones that can sense, decide, and adapt faster than competitors while maintaining coherent direction over time. The compound advantage you build through systematic strategic thinking creates optionality that multiplies over time. Better decisions create better results, which create more resources for strategic investment, which enable even better decisions. Stronger capabilities attract better people who amplify the capabilities further. Clearer principles attract better partners who extend your leverage beyond your direct control. This isn't just about building a successful business. It's about building a business that creates value for everyone it touches while giving you the freedom to focus on what matters most to you. It's about replacing the stress of constant firefighting with the satisfaction of systematic progress. It's about transforming from someone who works in the business to someone who works on the business. The choice is yours. You can continue operating on intuition, best practices, and inherited wisdom, hoping that harder work will eventually create breakthrough results. Or you can start building the strategic thinking system that will compound your advantage over time. The principles are in your hands, the frameworks are proven, the examples are real. One principled decision today beats 10 frantic moves tomorrow. Go.